The following video is a visual and somewhat playful representation of an article that I wrote called Let's Talk About Nature, specifically for people who might not want to sit and read an article for 10 minutes. I took some excerpts from that piece and put them together in this form that I hope is delightful and informative. And by all means, if you want to read the article itself, it will be in the links in the description below, as well as at the end of the presentation. So I hope you enjoy it.
Hi there, from the little floating head inside the presentation. Today we're going to talk about nature, and specifically we're going to speak about the ways that we talk about nature with each other. I'll be surveying three broad problems with the ways that nature is commonly used in conversation. This is the flattening of nature, the abstraction of nature, and the separation of humans and nature. But first, when I say nature, what comes to mind? Take a few moments and become aware of the images and the thoughts and the associations that flood into you when you hear this word. I actually surveyed a group of friends before making this, and it was really interesting to hear the different things that they came up with. One friend said it was the forest that she grew up in. Another friend said that nature for him is beauty and constant change. Another friend said that nature is protected sanctuaries. Nature is when you touch a rock and feel thousands of years of history traveling to your brain. That was a good one. And then someone else said rather wonderfully, I don't know. It's like looking at the soul of someone. And my point here is that when we use the word nature and we're in a room with 20 people, it's incredibly likely that every single person will come up with something different as to what that word means to them. And if we're in a corporate setting, it's also very likely that nature has become increasingly something that we must save and protect in order to maintain our social license to operate. And so nature has this sort of finality to it and desperation, because it's like, we must save nature. Because we've each had such unique experiences of nature in our lifetimes, we can't and shouldn't assume that other people are seeing the same thing in their mind's eye. And so what I'm going to speak about today are ways that we can expand the ways we speak about nature with each other instead of simplifying it. And in doing so, how we can deepen our appreciation of our relationship to nature. And so where should we start? I always love to start with etymology. I think we can learn a lot from where words come from. So in modern dictionaries, before this idea of nature as natural scenery, comes actually other definitions, which is the inherent character of a person or thing, and wonderfully, a creative force of the universe. This really surprised me. I wasn't expecting to see this, and I was rather pleased to see this in the dictionary. And then if we turn to Latin, so the roots of the English words, we find this idea of essential qualities or the innate disposition. The word natura can also be related to nasi, which is to birth or to be born. I don't know about you, but first of all, these definitions, I find them incredibly enriching, and they are not the usual definitions that come to many minds when we speak about nature in the day-to-day. What's also interesting to note is that they emerged from a time where human beings were embedded in the land. Nature was this character and this daily presence in our lifetimes, in our daily experience. And so the inherent nature or the creative force of the universe may have made more sense back then. Why are we more distant from these understandings of nature? I would argue that our severance from everyday, meaningful, and embodied interactions with the living world means that we tend to forget. And what we tend to forget is that when we're yearning to camp and sit by a fire at night, to listen to the lull of a river, to mountain climb and challenge ourselves, or to ski down a slope, we're not just scaling cliffs or looking for refuge. We're seeking to come into contact again with these innate qualities of our own being and with these creative forces of the universe that we call, quote unquote, nature. And now let's go into these three concepts. The first one is the flattening of nature. So we often refer to nature as a place or a thing or some kind of noun, but nature is both a planetary superorganism that we can call Gaia sometimes, and the countless species and their relationships that compose it. And so, although we may in conversation refer to the individual facets of nature that do interest us, whether aesthetically, economically, spiritually, nature is more than these facets. And it's the entirety of all of the things that make life possible and the individual components of that process. In that sense, nature is a living verb and verbs, if I may. And the process of those verbs is a relationship. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Buckminster Fuller. And he says, we, nature, seems to be a verb, an evolutionary process, and an integral function of the universe. And so we have to remember that when we talk about nature, it's not a place or a thing. It's this lattice of intercrossing lives. And as an example of different processes, you can take this idea that nature is a verdant rainforest, and it's the vines in that rainforest, the cells inside those vines that are photosynthesizing, the rains that come down and nourish the roots. Those rains themselves emerge from weather patterns that flow across the sky, rivers that carry rains from rainforests to mountains that flow away again and enter into the ocean. And that entire sort of amalgamation of processes and beings and species, that is nature. And so what do I mean when I speak about the abstraction of nature? What does it mean to abstract nature? In a very tangible meaning, to abstract nature is to take old growth forests and convert them to stacks of lumber, easily traded, fungible commodities, sometimes ironically even wood pellets for biofuels. It's to take the types of gardens that we lived with for thousands of years that were polycultural, that grew many different types of plants symbiotically with each other, and to convert that into vast expanses of dusty fields growing soy and corn. This emerged out of a process of domestication. We began to domesticate the wild, and we tried to create the types of assets that were easily understood, easily abstracted, and easily measured and bartered and sold. And in doing so, we reduced the complexity of an incredibly biodiverse and living world into something that was more of a shell of its prior self. And I would argue that the same thing happened with human beings. We traded minds. Instead of being these creatures who had to sense and adapt to landscapes and where our own neurons and neuronal maps were the maps of the land itself, we slowly reduced our connections with this complexity. And in doing so, so did our bodies and so did our minds. I think this shows up today very much in our current economic paradigm and the way that we speak about nature in financial terms. Nature is natural capital. It is a provider of services. A whale becomes a carbon sink worth $2 million, or that's its value of $2 million. And so, what happens when nature is described in this language of prices and calculations and offsets? Well, if this is the dominant way in which a human being hears and understands their relationship to nature, it further abstracts the relationship, it further commodifies it, and it makes nature only understandable in terms of financial worth. I'm not against understanding the economics of the living world in order to protect it or regenerate it. But what I will emphasize is that we need to create and become human beings who have more than these kinds of definitions internally as a relationship to the living world. And at the end of the day, if we ask whether a forest is worth more cut down or growing, we're asking the wrong question.
Slight computer malfunction, I'm back. Then there's this idea of the separation of humans and nature. I am guilty of this one very, very often. I put nature here and humans there, and I speak of us as if we were two different things. But a human being is encased and nestled within nature, natural systems. We are ourselves composed of trillions of non-human lives. Ask yourself, what is even so human about a human being? There is a temporary thing we can call a human being, but then that being dies and dissolves and becomes other forms of life, and is created and literally fed from the earth, from the soils, from the plants. And so I think it's incredibly artificial to try and point at the human being as something that is so different from this tree of life. And as you can see in this, this is a sequencing of RNA from 0.2% of all of the types of possible species that could even exist. And we are a mere fraction on that tree of life, and we exist within those nested holes. Part of the same thought is this idea that I've heard very often, which is we're screwing up the planet. Nature doesn't need us. We'd better just go. If anything, we're the ones that need nature. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that this holds a pretty pessimistic view of the human being and the role that we can play in the propagation of life. Historically, human beings have always tended to landscapes, sometimes destructively, but more often than not, if we look at different parts of the world, whereas that's the Amazon, where the native people there farmed terra preta, so dark soils, that captured carbon through biochar and created fertile conditions for them to grow a whole host of crops that wouldn't otherwise naturally grow in the jungle, to here in California, where the native people have done prescribed burns in the landscapes for hundreds of years, which allowed oak savannas to form. And those oaks created acorns, which fed not just the people, but the deer, the elk, the bears, and so on. There's many crops and many types of grasses, like sweetgrass, that actually have become so culturally enmeshed with human beings through many, many years of cultivation that they require human beings to propagate healthily. They require the disturbance created by the human plucking and moving of the soil to spread their own seeds and continue their lineages, if you will. And so I think the human beings have historically and to today, we have an incredible ability to observe life, to create niches, to bring in more biodiversity, to tend to the soil, and to create art from it. Like, that's what's so cool about people. Here I've included two pieces of art from my favorite land artists, Andy Goldsworthy and Niels Udo. Human beings also have this relatively unique capacity. Other animals can create forms of art, and they do. But human beings have this capacity to experience consciousness and our own minds, to experience the worlds around us, reflect them back, and create art that's inspired by the beauty of the world. We become students and scientists of these processes of life, and we create more of it and more of the evolutionary forces that branch to arrive at us and other forms of life. And so if you ask me, this idea of humans as separate from nature and humans that should be separated from nature, it doesn't make sense. And just a few closing thoughts to leave you with. It's clear that we have a long path ahead of regenerating our planet, undoing some of the damage that has been done, and taking a deep, hard look at ourselves and asking, what is a healthy relationship to all these other forms of life and living processes? And so in that sense, our regeneration of the planet requires a deepened relationship with nature. To deepen a relationship, you need language to do so. You need the mental concepts and you need the expansion of definitions which have become narrowed over time. As you remember, we had initially ideas of nature as a creative force of the universe, or innate qualities or disposition, or the idea of being born. The dynamic in which we speak about nature and how we feel about nature is self-reinforcing. So my provocation here, which takes a little bit of effort, a lot of imagination and creativity, takes us off of our default modes, and it asks, when we speak about nature with each other, unravel its many definitions. If someone tells you, I'm going out into nature, or I miss being in nature, ask them, like, what does nature mean to you? Like, maybe you and I think about that word really differently. That leads to really, really meaningful conversations. Develop your own unique language around what nature means to you. Create art if that's something that appeals to you. Resist abstraction and reduction to economic terms as much as is feasible. And when you do use those terms, just be very self-aware that nature transcends and goes far beyond our economic paradigm of its use for human endeavors. And please don't separate humans and nature. And if anything, try and include an understanding of human, cultural, symbiotic relationships in our definitions of a human being's role within and encased in these natural worlds. So that was fun. I hope that there was something that you can take out of this. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts. There's probably things you agree or don't agree with. Feel free to write to me. And if there's any parts of this you'd like in any kind of more detail, I'd be happy to do that. So thank you for tuning in and have a beautiful rest of your day.